Welcome to Relationships and Astrology and to our series on compatibility. And today we're going to look at Mars. I'm Margaret Gray in Dublin.
And I'm Armand Diaz in New York. And Margaret, I feel always that astrologers tend to give Mars the short shrift when it comes to relationships, which is almost inexplicable to me. Mars is the planet we associate with drive. It's the planet we associate with the way we assert ourselves, the way we fight. And it's the planet we associate with sex drive, among other things. And that's a hugely important thing in relationships. Somehow or another, Mars doesn't wind up getting the attention that we would expect.
I agree. I don't really know why that is, but it's really so important. It's really what attracts us, what turns us on. It's really part of that kind of chemistry. And of course, in a chart, it's very difficult to see. You can see if people are compatible, but it's very difficult to see if people are attracted to each other. But certainly Mars can give some indicators that there might be a possibility that might be there. So it's certainly a very, very important planet in relationships. And of course, it's also very connected to Venus. So when we look at Mars and Venus, we're really talking about the whole dynamic of passion, which is crucial in any relationship.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, in a moment, we will take a look at some images, and I think that they're very helpful. So let's go to the slides. And here's an image of Mars, and Mars is the god of war, and here he is with that fiery red color that goes on this image, and that is appropriate. The planet Mars itself, because of all of the oxidized iron on it, is a red planet, and it actually glows rather red in the sky. And I think right away that association with all of the things that are fiery and red and just it is fire.
What a wonderful, powerful image, Armand. And what it also reminds me of is that we talk about Mars as the warrior. And really, we develop Mars when we're about age 2 and when we learn how to say no to things. And that's a very important dynamic in relationship because we need difference as well as similarity. And so we need to be able to say no to somebody else and to have, behind that a very strong sense of ourselves. We need to have that difference and be able to work with that difference. So I think that's also where Mars comes in.
Certainly, and Mars has about a 2-year cycle too, so it is really about the time when Mars gets back to the place where it was when someone was born that the terrible twos begin. There is a little bit of warfare within the home, and it is the beginning of asserting that martial power.
Yes, that individuation, that individuality, that ability to really also deal with conflict in healthy ways. And sometimes I get a little bit concerned when couples say, in an ideal relationship, there ought to be no conflict. And that concerns me because I think conflict is that way of asserting difference. It's just a question of how do we assert that difference? How do we actually deal with conflict? And what an amazing image that is.
Yes, well, this is the first in, actually, it's not by the same painter, but this is the first in a series of 2. And here we have Mars and Venus, and clearly there is a strong relationship between the two. And here we have the martial sex drive and the Venusian. This is opulent surroundings, isn't it?
That's stunning.
It's beautiful, and yet I think what my favorite Mars Venus image is by Botticelli. And it looks like this is a slightly different setting, but it's the same theme. It looks like about 15 minutes later. And Venus is still wide awake and sort of looking over at Mars as though to say, huh, god of war, huh?
I love that one. Yes, and they're little angels or something looking on from behind, aren't they?
Oh, and they're playing with Mars's lance, and one's got his helmet on. They're really having some fun with him. And to me, this speaks on 2 levels. One, there is a little bit of masculine, feminine dynamic going on there. There's no getting around that. But I think to me, it also has a little bit of symbolic power to it because the Venusian relating principle is wide awake while the martial passion is asleep, dormant, happily not dead.
Yes.
And I think that is something that, in relationship, there's often that kind of, the relationship is still there, and yet passion is such an issue.
I agree with you. And I think that's where there, things like the moon come into play. And, I think that when relationships go more into, when Venus is lost and the moon comes to the fore, and I think this is, irrelevant in terms of gender. I think it can come with either partner, but where that role goes into the parenting role, where partners are looking for each other to be the parent rather than the equal, the lover, the spouse that's beside them. I think then some of those issues can certainly come to the fore. And I think also when Mars gets repressed or suppressed, whether it's due to culture or or it could be due to religion or spiritual beliefs, it can also be due to medication, of course, that, we're in a society which is very medicated in terms of what we label as depression. And a lot of antidepressants can also, of course, squash down sex drive and passion and all those things. So there's a lot of issues that are tied in. But really, as astrologers, I think it's so helpful to look at Mars and see how can Mars be strengthened within relationships if the issue of passion is facing challenges.
I often sort of probe around sometime and just ask about anger and how people express their anger. Because I feel that if you're not expressing that martial anger, it may be also very difficult to put it into sexuality. And particularly if we're talking about both anger and sexuality within a relationship.
Yes, and I think, one of the things is also when people start using substances like even just alcohol, where is the line in terms of drinking to enjoyment, and then where's the line where alcohol becomes a suppressant and, turns into anger, and then the passion gets squashed, and then of course can also come out as passive aggressiveness rather than as passion, and not just passion for another person, but also Mars is about passion for life, passion for something that we're interested in. Like a lot of us as astrologers are passionate about astrology, and artists are passionate about their craft. It's somehow finding something that, will activate that passion. And I think with Mars, one thing to remember is that just, taking some kind of action can really activate our Mars. Just movement, even physical movement, mental movement, doing something different can really help.
Absolutely. Physical movement is so important to get Mars going. And, any type of exercise, even taking a walk, just getting the blood flowing is so important. And I agree so very much that all of the martial things tend to go together. And if there isn't that passion for life, if you're not doing what you want to do, if you're not pushing yourself, and think about that Mars glyph, the circle with the arrow, which certainly has a certain sexual connotation, but it's also an upward pointing arrow that can be viewed in a couple of different ways. And if you're not moving forward, if you're not pushing forward in the things that you care about and the things that you're passionate about, it quelches Mars in every area.
One thing that's also interesting about that's related to that, I think, which I remember when I read the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, which is just a fabulous book, that really what I got from it was that the bottom line is that if we're not in touch with our needs and if we're not able to express our needs, that's really where Mars can come up in a way that can be more in terms of anger. But it's also a good alarm bell that something is out of sync. And so if we go back to looking, okay, what do I really need in this that I'm not getting, then it's much easier to get in touch with that side of Mars that tells us, okay, what do I need to do to get this then?
And actually, here comes a quote.
Yes, indeed. And this is a Mars quote in terms of really figuring out what is it that we desire. And that's really what, Mars is so linked to relationships in terms of what is it that we desire? What is it that we're attracted to? And of course, that also changes over our lifetime. So to be open to that. And again, it's about flexibility and movement and not getting too rigid and too stuck in something, but really being in touch with ourselves and being conscious.
And that is something that I think, one of the things that astrology is really great for recognizing and working with is the changing needs, that it's not static, that everything is always evolving or at least changing. And, the same set of circumstances that were in place when you were at a given age aren't necessarily going to be in the same a decade or two later.
Yes, that's very, very important. And also remembering that everybody has Mars in a different sign, in a different part of their chart, and really having, being able to step into their shoes and not assume that, what I desire is the same as what somebody else desires. And I think, like any of the planets, that's where astrology is so helpful, because understanding what our significant other desires can help us to maybe accommodate that, to find, a way that we meet in the middle with that, as with any planet.
Entirely so. And let's look at a couple of charts. These are the same charts we've been looking at in a few of our talks. And we'll start out with Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. And here we have Mars in Capricorn in Brad's chart, and Angelina Jolie has hers in the sign of Aries and conjunct the moon.
They're really so very different, aren't they? When I was looking at that, I was thinking about it, and I thought it's interesting because for him, he has both his Venus and Mars in the same sign. So in a sense, there's quite a cohesiveness between what he values and what he desires. And we might have mentioned that in our YouTube presentation on Venus. And Mars in Capricorn is really such a kind of hardworking, very focused, very practical Mars. Whereas Mars in Aries is really such a dynamic, adventure, playful, wanting something new. It's kind of it's got that childlike quality of Aries, whereas the Mars in Capricorn feels much more dogged. And I did kind of wonder, would Mars in Aries find Mars in Capricorn maybe a little boring at times? That was just something that I wondered.
Moving on to the Kennedys, we have another Mars-Moon connection over here. This is Jacqueline Kennedy's Mars and JFK's Moon.
Interesting, isn't it? Her Mars in Virgo, which is such, again, we've got another Mars in Earth, but a very different energy to Capricorn. It's that Virgo kind of, again, back to sort of, the word that comes to me with Virgo is elegance. It's kind of class, that she would be attracted to somebody who has elements of that. And it's also very mercurial, of course. So there's somebody who would be able to communicate clearly, be fairly bright, intelligent, all of those kind of qualities. And his Mars in Taurus, at least they have the Mars in the same element, which is, there's certainly a compatibility, I would think, there. I would imagine Mars in Taurus would be attracted to beauty. That would be one of the big things. And again, stability. I think Mars and Earth really wants some stability and security. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Because Taurus is such a sensual sign. There's a great deal of passion. And lands right, he has quite a constellation, or stellium, as we call it, landing right in her house of relationships. So when we're talking about Venus, we said they didn't really present as a very sexually strong couple. Maybe given the Mars, maybe we just weren't seeing it.
I think we might have underestimated it, yes.
And then we have Michael, and we have another Mars-Moon contact, and this time we have, and again, Catherine Zeta-Jones, Mars is in Capricorn.
So it feels a little bit different. I mean, what's your sense of the Mars and the air signs generally in comparison to Earth?
Mars in air signs, I think, is willing to consider the possibilities. There's a little bit of space between the impulse and the action, and that space is thought, and that can put a little bit of a delay on things, which is sometimes a good thing. In Mars in fire or Earth signs, sometimes we're off to the races right away. In air, I think that there is a little bit of time to stop and consider, take a little bit of perspective, or play with possibilities.
Yes, it's much more of an intellectual Mars, isn't it, as well? I think of it as the intellectual warrior, whereas the Mars in Earth is much more the practical warrior, the practical lover. It's much more Earth-based, yes.
I think it was Stephen Arroyo who said that Mars in the air signs is ready to consider anything sexually, but doesn't necessarily need to do anything. Something of an overestimation of it, I think. But
well, I think we might have to leave our audience with that thought, and we will meet again for our next recording. So see you soon. Thank you so much, Armand. Bye-bye.
Bye, Margaret.